Los Angeles International Airport hummed with quiet urgency. The red-eye flight to New York was fully booked, and passengers at Gate 32B moved with the sluggish patience of those resigned to a long night. The sterile glow of fluorescent lights cast pale shadows over travelers clutching coffee cups and murmuring into their phones. Barron Trump stood near the first-class boarding lane, a hardcover book in his hands. He wasn't scrolling through his phone, wasn't speaking to anyone. He simply read, his tall frame still as passengers stole quick glances his way. The name alone turned heads, but he had learned to tune it out. A few feet away, Michael Reynolds, a middle-aged investment broker, checked his watch and scoffed. "That kid's flying first class?" he muttered to the woman beside him. "Figures. Some people are just born lucky." The woman glanced at Barron but said nothing. Michael shook his head and stepped forward as the first-class boarding call rang through the speakers. Further down the terminal, Walter Harrison adjusted the strap of his weathered leather duffel. His purple heart pin, worn and faded, caught the dim airport lights as he moved toward the economy boarding lane. A little girl pointed at him. "Mommy, is he a soldier?" Her mother gave a small smile. "He was, sweetheart. A long time ago." Walter nodded in quiet acknowledgement before continuing forward. Inside the plane, passengers settled into their seats. Barron lowered himself into the wide leather cushion of 2A, flipping a page in his book as a flight attendant offered him a drink. He declined with a polite shake of his head. In the rear cabin, Walter reached 34B and let out a slow breath. The cramped space was less than ideal, but he had learned long ago that comfort was a privilege. As he adjusted his bag, his seatmate, a man in his mid-30s with wireless headphones, looked up and frowned. "You're sitting here?" Walter nodded, tucking his ticket into his pocket. "That's what my boarding pass says." The man sighed. "Damn, thought I had an empty row." Walter eased into the middle seat, keeping his movements slow, careful. Lisa Carter, a flight attendant with a sharp eye for details, caught the exchange. She had been flying long enough to recognize a veteran when she saw one. And she had been flying long enough to know when someone didn't belong in economy. A soft ding. A call button. Lisa moved toward the source, Walter's seatmate, who was shifting uncomfortably. I need a different seat." Lisa blinked. "I'm sorry." The man lowered his voice. I can't sit here. Is there anywhere else I can go?" Lisa's smile tightened. "The flight is full, sir." The man hesitated. "Not even first class?" Barron pressed his own call button. Lisa turned. He was watching her, calm and unreadable. "Yes, Mr. Trump? Can I switch seats with the man in the military jacket?" Lisa froze for half a second. "You want to switch?" Barron nodded once. A woman across the aisle leaned in. "You don't have to do that, you know. You paid for this seat." Barron met her gaze, then shrugged. "Some people deserve it more." Lisa exhaled and moved toward Walter's row. "Sir, there's a passenger in first class who'd like to offer you his seat." Walter frowned. "I don't understand." Lisa smiled. "He'd like to switch with you." Walter turned just as Barron stood, grabbing his bag from the overhead bin. The older man stiffened. "Are you sure, son?" Barron extended a hand. "Yes, sir." Walter studied the young man for a long moment before clasping his hand in a firm shake. Lisa exhaled as Walter rose. The murmurs started immediately. Passengers whispered, some nudging each other, others raising their phones. Barron slid into the economy seat without hesitation. Lisa passed by a moment later, voice low. "Are you sure you don't need anything?" Barron shook his head. "I'm good." Walter settled into first class, fingers grazing the soft leather armrest. "It's been years since I've been treated like this," he murmured. He turned slightly, looking back toward economy, where Barron sat, eyes on his book. Something about this night felt significant, as if it was only the beginning. The cabin lights dimmed as Flight 227 cruised through the night sky, leaving the glow of Los Angeles behind. Outside, the world was a vast stretch of darkness, the occasional glimmer of city lights flickering below like distant stars. Inside, the hum of the engines filled the quiet space, a steady rhythm that underscored the murmurs of passengers settling in for the long flight. Walter Harrison leaned back into the plush leather of his new seat, his fingers grazing the smooth armrest as if testing its reality. The last time he had experienced this kind of comfort on a flight, it had been decades ago, back when soldiers weren't just names in history books, but men stepping off planes, welcomed home as heroes, or, in some cases, barely acknowledged at all. He exhaled slowly, adjusting the blanket a flight attendant had draped over his lap, his old joints grateful for the warmth. From his place in economy, Barron Trump sat with quiet composure, long legs folded into the tighter space, his book resting open in his lap. If he noticed the occasional glance from curious passengers, he gave no indication. He simply turned another page, as though nothing unusual had happened. A few seats away, Michael Reynolds had been watching the entire exchange. The businessman, who had initially dismissed Barron as just another privileged kid, found himself studying the teenager with new eyes. The boy hadn't hesitated, hadn't made a show of his generosity, just acted, without expectation of praise. Lisa Carter moved through the first-class cabin, checking on passengers. When she reached Walter's row, she smiled warmly. "Would you like something to drink, Mr. Harrison?" Walter glanced up, the question pulling him from his thoughts. "Just water, please." She nodded, stepping away, but before she could leave, a voice came from the seat beside Walter. "Excuse me." The man sitting next to him, a middle-aged passenger with salt and pepper hair and kind but weary eyes, leaned slightly closer. "I just wanted to say what that young man did for you back there. That was something." Walter studied him for a beat before nodding. "Yes, it was." The man hesitated, then extended a hand. "Daniel Brooks." Walter shook it firmly. "Walter Harrison." Daniel offered a small smile. "I don't mean to pry, but I saw your jacket." "Vietnam." Walter's lips pressed into a thin line before he gave a slow nod. "Yes." Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his chin. "My father was there. He never talked about it much, but I know it changed him." Walter's eyes softened. "It changes all of us." A pause settled between them, thick with unspoken memories. Then, as if compelled by the weight of the moment, Walter sighed and adjusted the small pin on his lapel. The Purple Heart, worn but never forgotten. "That young man who gave me his seat," he said quietly. "His family once did something for me that I never got to repay." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Walter leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling, as if searching for the right words. "It was a long time ago. I was fresh out of the service, trying to find my way back into a world that had moved on without me. No home, no real prospects, just a duffel bag and a lot of bad memories." Daniel listened intently, his brows furrowing as Walter continued. "I ended up in New York, scraping by. One night, I was sitting outside a diner, trying to figure out my next move, when a man walked up to me. He could have just kept walking. Most people did. But instead, he sat down and talked to me." Walter's voice grew distant, as if he were stepping back into that night. "He asked me about my service. Listened, really listened. And when I told him I had nowhere to go, he didn't just hand me a couple of bucks and walk away. He made a call, got me a job at a construction site, a place to stay while I got back on my feet." Daniel tilted his head. "Who was he?" Walter's gaze flickered, something heavy settling behind his eyes. "Fred Trump." Daniel straightened slightly. "Wait, Donald Trump's father?" Walter nodded. "Yes. He didn't owe me a damn thing, but he helped me anyway. Told me, 'You serve this country. It's the least we can do.'" He let out a quiet chuckle. I never forgot those words. A ripple of quiet conversation spread through the nearby rows as passengers subtly leaned in, absorbing every word. The revelation had begun to travel, like a whisper passed from seat to seat. In economy, Barron remained unaware, his focus still on his book, oblivious to the fact that his simple act of kindness had just set something far greater into motion. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and rhythmic against the quiet murmur of conversation. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and blankets, their voices hushed as if sensing the weight of something unspoken settling over the plane. The atmosphere had shifted, subtly at first, like a ripple across still water. But now it was undeniable. Passengers exchanged glances, whispers passing between them like static electricity. A name had been spoken, one tied to history, to legacy. And in first class, Walter Harrison sat with his fingers resting lightly against the armrest, his thoughts miles away from the seat he occupied. Across from him, Daniel Brooks let out a slow breath. "Fred Trump," he repeated, as if trying to fit the name into the puzzle of the story he had just heard. "The same Fred Trump who built half of New York?" Walter gave a small nod. "That's the one." Daniel shook his head, glancing toward the back of the plane, where Barron Trump remained unaware of the conversation unfolding. "And now, Decades later, his grandson just gave up his seat for you. Walter exhaled, his expression unreadable. Life's got a funny way of coming full circle. A few rows over, Lisa Carter had paused in the aisle, her tray of drinks momentarily forgotten. She had caught enough of the exchange to understand the significance of what had just been revealed. With a quiet intake of breath, she turned and made her way toward the economy section. Barron was still where she had left him, legs folded into the cramped seat, book open in his lap. He had barely moved since taking his place in 34B, seemingly unaffected by the shift in attention around him. Lisa crouched beside him, keeping her voice low. "Mr. Trump?" Barron blinked, looking up. "Yes." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I just thought you might want to know. The gentleman you gave your seat to, Walter, he shared something remarkable about your family." Barron closed his book, his expression neutral. "Oh." Lisa swallowed. "Years ago, when he returned from Vietnam, your grandfather helped him. Gave him a job, a place to stay when he had nothing. He said he never got to repay that kindness." For the first time since boarding the plane, Barron's expression flickered, just for a second. A shift, subtle but undeniable. His gaze drifted past Lisa, toward the first-class cabin, where Walter sat unaware of the conversation now revolving around him. Lisa studied him, searching for a reaction. Barron was difficult to read, reserved, measured. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "That's something," he murmured. Lisa gave a small nod. "I thought you should know." She straightened, moving back toward the front of the plane, leaving Barron with his thoughts. He stared at the cover of his book for a long moment before slipping a finger between the pages, marking his place, and setting it aside. In first class, Walter adjusted in his seat, glancing toward the aisle as if sensing the shift in energy around him. The flight attendants moved with more deliberation now, their expressions softer. Passengers stole glances his way, their conversations hushed but charged with a quiet reverence. Daniel leaned back, shaking his head with a low chuckle. "You know, my father used to tell me that the smallest kindness can outlive a lifetime." Walter let out a breath. Your father was right. Across the plane, the weight of those words settled in. Passengers who had once been lost in their own worlds now found themselves drawn to the quiet connection unfolding in the air between New York and Los Angeles. And as the plane soared through the night, the story, one of debt repaid in the most unexpected way, continued to ripple outward, touching everyone in its path. The quiet hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady pulse beneath the whispered conversation spreading like wildfire. Something had shifted. The air felt different now, charged, as if an invisible thread had woven through the passengers, connecting them in a way none of them had expected when they boarded Flight 227. Walter sat in first class, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, though his mind was elsewhere. Decades of memory stirred, brought back to life by the unexpected kindness of a young man who, unknowingly, had closed a loop that had remained open for far too long. Daniel Brooks exhaled, still shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't think I've ever heard a story like that. It's almost too perfect to be real." Walter let out a quiet chuckle. "Life has a way of surprising you." From across the aisle, a woman leaned forward slightly. She had been listening, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. "I couldn't help but overhear what you said about Fred Trump, about his kindness." She hesitated, as if debating whether to continue. "It reminds me of something my father used to say." Walter turned to her, his eyes steady. "What was that?" She smiled faintly. "That a single act of kindness can ripple through generations." A murmur of agreement passed between nearby passengers. The weight of her words settled over them, not heavy, but warm, like the realization of something they had always known but had never truly seen in action. From the back of the plane, Lisa Carter moved through the aisle, her gaze flicking toward Barron. He was no longer reading. His book sat closed in his lap, his long fingers draped over the cover. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, but there was something different in his posture, an awareness, a quiet contemplation. A few seats away, Michael Reynolds, the same businessman who had scoffed at Barron earlier, shifted in his seat. He had spent years believing in hard work, in merit, in the idea that no one simply deserved something without earning it. And yet, what he had witnessed tonight had unsettled something in him. He glanced toward Barron and exhaled. "Kid," he said, his voice low but firm. Barron turned his head slightly. Michael hesitated, then nodded once. "That was a hell of a thing you did back there." Barron didn't react right away. Then, with the smallest of smiles, he shrugged. "It just seemed like the right thing to do." Michael studied him for a moment longer before giving a small, approving nod and returning to his drink. In first class, Walter adjusted in his seat, then glanced toward Lisa as she passed. His voice was quiet when he spoke. Does the boy know? Lisa paused. Know what? Walter's fingers brushed over the worn fabric of his jacket. Who his grandfather was to me. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. I told him. Walter absorbed that, his lips pressing together in thought. Then, after a beat, he sighed. Good. Daniel, still sitting beside him, smirked. Are you going to talk to him? Walter chuckled. Maybe I should. The words lingered between them as the flight continued through the night, each passenger lost in their own thoughts, each of them carrying a piece of the story that had unexpectedly bound them together. And somewhere, high above the sleeping world, the weight of a debt long forgotten had finally been lifted. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into New York. The quiet hum of the cabin shifted as passengers stirred, stretching stiff limbs, fastening seatbelts. The long night was coming to an end. But for some, something far greater had just begun. Walter Harrison inhaled deeply, his fingers tightening slightly around the edges of his armrest. He had spent a lifetime boarding planes, leaving places behind. But tonight, this felt different. He turned his head, looking toward the economy section. The boy was still there, still quiet, still unaware that, in the course of a single flight, he had unknowingly restored something in Walter, a belief, a connection, an unspoken debt that had finally been repaid. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Walter stood. The cabin was still settling, passengers murmuring about connections and baggage claims, but he had no intention of letting the moment slip away. Step by step, he made his way toward the back, his gait slow but steady. Barron Trump looked up as the older man stopped beside his row. For a moment, they simply studied each other. Walter took in the sharp blue eyes, the composed expression, so much like the man he had met all those years ago outside a diner in New York. In Barron, he saw something he hadn't expected, a quiet understanding, a weight in the older man's gaze that went beyond gratitude. Walter extended a hand. Young man, he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. I wanted to thank you face to face. What you did tonight, it meant more than you know. Barron met his grip firmly, his voice calm. It wasn't a big deal, sir. Walter held his gaze. It was. And not just to me. A silence stretched between them, full, not empty. Around them, passengers watched, some openly, some discreetly. But in this moment, it was just them. Walter's lips curled into the faintest smile. Your grandfather would have been proud. Barron hesitated. Then, for the first time that night, something softened in his expression. Maybe, he said. I hope so. Walter gave a slow nod, then released his grip, stepping back. Take care of yourself, son. Barron returned the nod, watching as the older man turned and made his way toward the exit. Passengers lingered as they filed off the plane, many pausing to shake Walter's hand, to offer words of thanks not just for his service, but for the story that had unfolded at 35,000 feet. Even Michael Reynolds, the once skeptical businessman, gave Barron a parting glance of quiet respect before disappearing into the crowd. By the time Barron stepped into the terminal, he pulled out his phone, hesitating only briefly before typing a message. Grandpa would have been proud today. He stared at the words for a moment. Then, without another thought, he hit send.